Welcome to the Southern Voice Rock Show. Here's your host, Jim Harris.
We have an episode today we think you're really going to like, especially if you are a Southern rock fan. We have Eddie Stone from Doc Holliday and Wet Willie with us. Also, Rob Walker from Stillwater is going to give us the backstory on their classic Mindbender. And Steve Hammond, brother of the late, great Atlanta Rhythm Section frontman Ronnie Hammond, is going to share with us a couple of stories about ARS and Ronnie. So, let's get started. Eddie, welcome to the Southern Voice Rock Show.
Hey, man, it's great to be here.
Eddie, give us a little background. You guys started out, I guess, the Roundhouse is the band that eventually became Doc Holliday, correct?
That's correct. Originally, the band Roundhouse started in like 1970, I think. And I got drafted in 72, got home in 74, and then Roundhouse was kind of defunct, and the leader of the band, Bruce Brookshire, and I reassembled it. And it took a while, but just a short time later, we were signing a deal with A&M Records and changing our name.
Yeah, that was another interesting story I wanted to give you a chance to touch on. I heard that you guys discovered that there was maybe a band out of Canada that had already recorded under Roundhouse, so you guys were left with picking a new name, and I heard that you went about it in a very interesting way.
Well, yeah, and that's true. There was supposed to be a band in Canada called Roundhouse that was currently touring and recording. So we decided we would change the name at A&M Records, a suggestion. So we started searching. I had a book called The Legends of the Old West, one of those Life magazine books that they used to sell. And I was reading about it, and I thought, well, maybe I'll find some here, songwriting inspiration, something. But anyway, I started reading about Doc Holliday, John Henry Holliday, and I did not know at the time, but he was from the state of Georgia. So I said, well, he was kind of an ornery cuss, so that's a good suggestion. So we had that, and I think there was another one called Rebel Gray, and there was a third suggestion. Don't know what it was, but we let the local clientele of our local rock station choose the name. They called and voted on it.
And Doc Holliday was born.
It was born. That was it.
Well, now I'll back up a little bit, and I will let our listeners know that you are from what is arguably the greatest rock and roll city in America, Lawrenceville, Georgia.
Lawrenceville, Georgia. You're correct.
So you and I share a hometown. So in the world of great rock and rollers, there's you, who's a great player. There was James Quill Smith, who played for John Mayall and Three Dog Night. And then there's me, who is nothing more than a big fan.
And just a little south of there was the country legend, Gid Tanner.
From Decula, Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers. And I believe, if memory serves me correctly, that in the late 1920s, that their record was the first record ever to be certified as a gold record.
I've heard that, and I believe that.
A song called Down Yonder, I believe.
Down Yonder. Gid Tanner when I was a child, used to be my barber. And I didn't know that there was anything else that went to that until my dad said he was going to start playing the Saturday night jamboree that Gid had in his barbershop. And my dad played steel guitar. So he got to where he was playing most Saturday nights, you know. So that was kind of neat. It was a huge barbershop. It would hold 50, 75 people, which that was a lot of people around Decula. And they would do a jamboree and dance and sing and holler and stomp the feet. And then about 2 or 3 times a year, a guy from New York would come down with a ugly-looking box and set it up and record Gid Tanner's next album.
What a great music legacy in Gwinnett County, Georgia, huh?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, his grandson went on to have a roots band, Americana-type, harder-type band called Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers. And he did a couple albums. So, I mean, kind of keeping keeping it alive. But Gid was one of the first two people in the Country Music Hall of Fame. The second person was a guy that he did a lot of playing and recording with named Riley Puckett. They are the real stars of Georgia as far as I'm concerned. That's some of the first ones that I knew about.
Absolutely. And that's, for those that don't know, Decula is about 8 miles away from your and my hometown of Lawrenceville, Georgia.
That's true.
Jumping back into Doc Holliday, you guys signed up with, I believe, A&M, and your first album was entitled Doc Holliday, and it did pretty well.
It did real well. It did kind of like well on weird fronts. Instead of any place in the United States all honing in on the same songs, they didn't. You went up north and there was Magic Midnight. You come down south and there was I'm a Rocker. And out west, there was Somebody Help Me. And I mean, it was really strange. It was almost divided all across the U.S., which track was the most popular. And it was a blessing and a curse all at the same time, in that it didn't equate to one song going over the edge.
Well, that album led to another, and you guys really made your bones touring. I mean, you guys were road warriors, correct?
Yeah. During the first two records, we were doing close to 300 days a year.
And now you guys toured with, I know you were on a big tour with Black Sabbath pretty early on.
That was on the second album, Rides Again album. That was the Black Sabbath Mob Rules tour. That was a huge tour. And on the first album, we toured with the Outlaws on the Ghost Riders tours. And we were with April Wine and Loverboy on the Nature of the Beast tour. We were very hard-edged rock, so we played with a lot of people that per se weren't just Southern rockers, you know.
You mentioned Loverboy and April Wine, so there's a couple of other Canadians entering into the picture along with the first Canadian Roundhouse, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
On those early tours, Eddie, who that you toured with in a support role really stood out for you? Who are the bands that, looking back, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we had an opportunity to play with these guys?
Well, Greg Allman comes to mind. We did dates with Greg and the Allman Brothers. And on the first album, it was the Outlaws. That was the ones that did it for us. And April Wine, both. The master of all of them was Black Sabbath tour with Ronnie James Dio. Ronnie James Dio was just one of the greatest guys in the whole wide world. They called us back out on the closing end of the tour to finish some dates. Tony Iommi's father passed away, and we missed some dates. One of them was Madison Square Garden. Well, he was true to his word and called us back. And when they went back out, we were with him. We played Madison Square Garden with Black Sabbath. He said, I got you here. You're on your own now.
And obviously you guys on a lot of tracks can really rock it out, but you never lose sight of the fact that you guys have heavy Southern influences. As far as the audiences were concerned, how did that mesh with the more heavy metal sound of Black Sabbath?
Well, at first it was strange. They didn't want to accept it. But about halfway through the show, you'd see the Black Sabbath Ronnie Dio horns coming out on song. God, their crowd is pretty loyal. They're even divided amongst themselves. Some of them wouldn't go see Black Sabbath with Ronnie Dio singing because of Ozzy, and some of them didn't want to hear Ozzy anymore. Very strange bunch, but we did manage to win them over. I think a lot of that was help. We got good mentions from Black Sabbath from the stage every night. I think that the audiences warmed up to us rather well. We got an encore in Madison Square Garden, and A&M had already said, look, guys, get on, get off. And it didn't work that way.
Eddie, I also don't want to fail to mention your two solo albums, and you had some serious guest star horsepower. Guys from Stillwater, Cowboy Eddie Long, Paul Hornsby, Chris Hicks from Marshall Tucker Band, David Ragsdale from Kansas. Pretty impressive group of talent.
Yeah, and plus all of my Doc Holliday guys pitched in and helped on the second solo album.
I want to make sure I'm invited when you have all these guys over to your house.
Not a problem.
Doc Holliday, about your third or fourth album, you guys went in the studio and cut it in Germany. Is that correct?
In Munich, Germany. It was the third album.
And was that the one that you felt like they kind of led you off of your identity?
Yeah, it was produced by a quite famous producer, and he produced some heavy metal stuff later on, named Mac. But the biggest stuff that Mac did was he produced Queen from like Another One Bites the Dust on through. Did all of those albums. And he also engineered all the ELO albums. But he didn't care for the southern sound. He didn't like the Hammond organ, and he didn't like the loud guitars quite so much either. So it was not the match made in heaven.
What was the album that you felt like took you all back to the true Doc Holliday?
Well, it started with the fourth album, Danger Zone, but we went real hard on the rock edge of it. Probably the fifth album or so, when we first started doing albums on the German record labels. That was when we got back to our southern roots. And there was a string of about 4 or 5 albums that were that way.
So you guys started a long, long time ago. I think your first album dropped 80, 81, right?
Yeah, I dropped in 80, I believe.
Somewhere along the lines, you guys became very popular in certain regions of Europe, and up until COVID, I think, kind of derailed it. You guys were going back to Europe pretty regularly and playing some really big shows.
Yeah, we did that. Europe and Scandinavia. We played the Sweden Rock Festival 3 times, I think, during that period of time. And that's the largest rock festival in the world. There's 350,000 people there every year. And you name it, play them. Yeah, we did that. Did a lot of big festivals in Germany. Played a lot in the UK. Were very well received everywhere we went. But Germany almost became like second home. They adopted us. That was everything. Germany and Finland.
It's interesting, but I think Mother's Finest enjoys a very similar relationship in Europe. They tour Europe every year, and they have a very huge and very well-established fan base there. It's interesting how these folks love American and American rock from the South. That's great.
Yeah, they do. It's funny about Mother's Finest and the Georgia Satellites. Usually every time we were in Europe, one of them was one day ahead of us and another one was one day behind us, doing the same places.
A couple of pretty good bands there.
Yeah, oh yeah, not bad.
You told me a couple of bands that later went on to, let's say, some pretty big things that got their start early on. They were supporting acts for you guys. Tell us about those.
One of the first ones we talked about was REM. And REM opened for us at a club in Columbia, South Carolina, and which is, I guess, the home of the University of South Carolina. And then a few years later, we played another place in Columbia, South Carolina, and it was a young and up-and-coming band named Hootie and the Blowfish that played. It was kind of funny. They were searching, both of them, when we saw them, they were searching for what it is they were going to do. But the college crowds were just eating them up, either way. I'm sure he took notes, as we did when we would play with Hydra, Ted Nugent and Bob Seger and people like that when we were coming up. We took notes. And Wet Willie was huge experience for us opening shows. We learned what it was like to really put on a show and really how to work a crowd. So if you're worth your salt, you pay attention on the way up, and that way when you get there, you use what you get.
Eddie, you mentioned a band there that I guess that a lot of our listeners may not have ever heard of, but amongst those in the music community, they were considered to be outstanding musicians and an incredible band, and that's Hydra out of Atlanta.
Amazing band. I saw them when we were playing with them, and they were, already stars to us, but I saw them with Humble Pie. I saw them with Leonard Skinner. I saw them with the Allman Brothers Band. I saw them with Ted Nugent. I saw them with all the hard rock bands, and they held their own with any of them. They were an amazing band live.
I think everyone in the music business that has seen them play, especially the guitar player, Spencer Kirkpatrick, would put him up in the upper echelon against some really solid players.
Without a doubt. I mean, Marriott loved him. Frampton loved him. Leonard Skinner absolutely loved him. When they were reforming the band and they were getting things together, they had a guy that got sick for a couple, 3-4 weeks, and they were actually had Spencer come and rehearse with the band.
Wow.
Playing dates with Skinner and possibly joining the band. He could make some waves, let me tell you. He could play.
So, Eddie, you're now connected with a band that a lot of people will know, the guy that's the front man and I think the founder of the band. You're playing with a fellow named Jimmy Hall in a band called Wet Willie.
Yeah, I've been playing with Wet Willie. I'm the new guy in the band. I've been playing about, 15 to 18 years, something like
The
that.
new guy.
You got the Hall brothers. You got Jack playing bass, Jimmy's brother. And then you got Donna. She's the Willie Ed. She's still singing. And Ricky Hirsch, who went on to play with Greg Allman, and Joan Armstrong. He comes back and plays most of the shows on guitars. So it's kind of like old home week when we do that.
Last question. Jimmy Hall, Wet Willie. Jimmy was touring Europe recently with Jeff Beck. Is that correct?
He did Europe and the United States with Jeff Beck. Off and on, he's been with Jeff for like 20-something years.
Wow.
If you look on YouTube, Jeff Beck with Jimmy Hall, you can see some amazing footage, I'm telling you.
How would you rank Jeff Beck in the group of great guitar players?
He is either 2, 3, or 4, or all of the above. You can get the same answer out of Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page.
All right. Well, I'm going to throw one more last question at you.
Yeah, we can do last. I'm good at it.
In the world of Southern rock, obviously, you've seen a lot of great shows from the side of the stage, in front of the stage, from the stage. Outside of Doc Holliday and Wet Willie, best Southern rock band, best show you've ever seen?
Best Southern rock band, best show I've ever seen. It would have to be the original 6 of Skinner, or 7. I can't remember how many there were. I saw them, and it'd have to be tied with the Allman Brothers Band.
I'd say that's 2 pretty credible contestants there.
And the rest of us, which I'm putting Charlie Daniels, Doc Holliday, Molly Hatchet, Blackfoot, Wet Willie, all of them, we just all heaped in a big old pile after that. Those 2 were just, nothing beat Greg Allman's voice. Nothing beat the original 6 with Dwayne and Dickie playing together with Barry Oakley playing bass. But they've had some amazing bands afterwards that were definitely worth seeing, and I saw them all. Down all the way to the Warren Haynes, Gary Trucks thing. I mean, it's amazing stuff. But the original Skinner was just one of those bands that just went out there and they were going to cut your head off. They were there to cut heads. Not to blow anybody off stage. They were just there to kick somebody's ass, whether it was the crowd or anybody in the way.
Eddie, you got some great stories, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your rock and roll history with us. And I know that our listeners are going to be really appreciative of the opportunity to get to know more about you and Doc Holliday and Wet Willie, and kind of reignite that passion for that great music of the day, and then excitement about the new stuff that's coming. So thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate it. If I could put a shout out to my brothers from the Doc Holliday days of Europe, going to Bruce Brookshire and John Samuelson, Daniel Bud Ford, and Daniel Lastinger. And everybody, please don't forget my boy Rick Skelton and Herman Nixon, the original guys that have passed on. we're all one big family.
This week's Liner Notes, we want to talk about the 2012 Atlanta Rhythm Section album, From the Vaults. It's a collection of hits and also includes a couple of songs from the Candymen and a Noah's Ark song. It also has an interesting backstory on the remake of the Atlanta Rhythm Section song, Conversation. Rodney Mills invited Ronnie Hammond to his home where he has a studio, and they began cutting tracks to remake Conversation. The project wasn't finished, and they had plans to complete it in the future. Unfortunately, Ronnie passed away and was never able to complete it. Rodney Mills invited Rodney Justo, the current lead singer of the Atlanta Rhythm Section, to add the remaining vocals necessary to complete the song, and ended up with the only song where the two Atlanta Rhythm Section lead singers ever shared vocal duties. From the Vaults, 2012 Atlanta Rhythm Section, and be sure to check out the song Conversation. All right, so today we have with us part of the 3-guitar attack from the band Stillwater. Now, I recently wrote a feature article about this band, their connection to the movie Almost Famous, their relationship with Capricorn, their association with some of the great moments and great acts in Southern rock and roll. And it's hard to talk about Stillwater without talking about Mindbender. And so I think that leads us into the first question we want to ask Rob. Rob, welcome to the Southern Voice Rock Show.
Well, man, thanks so much, Jim, for having me. Mighty glad to be here.
Appreciate you taking the time. Let's jump right in. I know our folks are going to want to hear a little background on the song Mindbender. Tell us a little bit about how that came to be.
The whole voice box thing came about. We played our material for a producer for Buddy Bowie up in Atlanta at this big rehearsal hall. And one of the songs that we were playing that day, I used a voice box in. And it was like a little blues tune, and I played through it. And after we got done, Buddy just came up to me and said, we really ought to do a song that utilizes that. And he kind of came up with the idea of maybe doing a song about a talking guitar, I was a little bit taken back by it, but I didn't say anything. But anyway, we went with it, and it ended up being really, an amazing tune. It was like we recorded everything else first. At the end of the session, Buddy said, I want to go up to Lake Lanier and do some writing, and see if we can't finish that song, We did some other tweaks on some of the other material up there, too, before we recorded the vocals. So, anyway, that's what happened. It ended up being the last song we recorded for the album. Kind of like, when Charlie did went down to Georgia, I think it was an afterthought.
Now, do I remember correctly, Rob, not only did it have the talkbox connection, but it had its roots in a lick that you had been just kind of messing around with?
Yes, the riff that for the song was really just, I was just looking around one day, trying to play Evil by Howlin' Wolf just by myself, Robert Johnson style, and there's a little riff that was in my head in there, I was trying to use that as a little fill in there. That was a riff that I played for Buddy. And
the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, he used to call it the Roebuck Staples. He thought it sounded like Pop Staples, the lick that I was playing, and he said, what was that Roebuck Staples lick you were playing? It really ended up being something special, and it really kind of a surprise. And to me, the recording process with that was really interesting too, because that was the one song that we all went in and we played basically in the studio. We came up with our parts based on the sounds that were coming out of the main speakers. I don't know if that makes sense, but normally you go out and play something live and you come up with your parts and play them live. The actual sound of the guitar, I could go in there and hear the sound of that guitar that they dialed in. And it was really, it kind of made where you're playing with the actual sounds that are going down the recording. It was really kind of interesting.
Well, Studio One, of course, where you guys recorded that, was known for having a rather unique sound.
Oh, yeah. That amazing.
In this week's covers, we want to suggest a remake of the Lynyrd Skynyrd classic Simple Man by another Jacksonville rock band, Shinedown. It was on their 2003 album, Leave a Whisper. The song was released as a single, went all the way to number 5, and was certified platinum. It's one of 22 gold and platinum records from Shinedown, and we think it's worth a listen. We are honored to have Steve Hammond with us. Steve, welcome to the Southern Voice Rock Show. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here.
You are the brother of the late, great frontman Ronnie Hammond, and also you appeared on some ARS recordings yourself, and you've done some time, if you will, as a musician in your own right, and you're going to tell us a couple of Ronnie and ARS stories today, so we're looking forward to that.
Thank you, Jim.
Let's jump into them.
All right, well, let me try to put things in perspective a little bit, Jim, to start with. I was very involved with Ronnie's music from pretty much day one, and I was fortunate enough to be at Studio One during the recording of about 4 albums. The first one would have been in 1974. That would have been Dog Days. Then in 1978, Underdog. 1979, Are You Ready? And then finally, 1980, Boys from Doraville. There's actually one particular year and it was during the recording of Underdog that I want to share with you. It's kind of a unique story about Ronnie. It tells a little bit about Ronnie, who he was, and the kind of person he was. Basically, the song that was recorded was Indigo Passion. And at that time, I was fortunate enough to be in the vocal booth with Ronnie when he did the vocal tracks for that song. So Ronnie was the kind of person, he basically wore his heart on his sleeve, and he was just a good-hearted person. So when he was singing the song, it was just very emotional for him. And, he fought back the tears and cried and tried to sing at the same time. And I think anybody that's ever done any singing knows that if you start crying when you're singing, it's not going to work out. Basically, Rodney finally said, Hammond, you need to dry it up. And finally he did. And they got all the vocal tracks recorded on that song. And that's just a really beautiful song. And I was just really happy I could be there and share this very personal story about how songs are recorded and some of the personal emotions behind those songs.
Do you think Ronnie had a favorite of all the ARS songs that he was a part of? And there were obviously quite a lot.
I think he probably had a couple of favorites, Jim. One would have been Normal Love, and the other would have been Conversation.
Well, we have an interesting story about Conversation, a remake that is, to the best of my knowledge, the only track that Ronnie and Rodney Justo's vocals appear on together. That was on the Vault album, and that's an interesting story that we'll circle back around to, if that's okay.
Yes, sir, that's fine.
And you have another story for us.
I do. I actually worked with the Atlanta Rhythm Section a couple of years, 1979 and 1980. So the next story that I wanted to share with you is a story from the road. And sometimes those can be the most interesting stories of all. But anyway, we were in Corpus Christi, Texas, on the interstate somewhere. And there was a tractor trailer going the opposite direction that we were going. And apparently the guy fell asleep and crashed into a guardrail, and the tractor trailer caught on fire. So we pulled the tour bus over. And Ronnie, myself, Sammy Ammons, JR, and Roy Yeager jumped out of the bus and went over there to the tractor trailer that was on fire and pulled the guy out and basically kept him from losing his life and burning alive there. We were all covered in diesel fuel, and adrenaline was just flowing like I've never felt it before. And it turns out that guy was from Norcross, Georgia.
What a small world. And how fortunate he was.
Yeah, he was at the right place at the right time as far as we were concerned.
Well, Steve, the beautiful thing about that story is that most rock and roll stories that you hear have to do with, driving a car into a swimming pool or throwing televisions out of a hotel room window or that kind of extreme stuff. And I'm sure that, ARS at some point in time probably had some stories that may fit into that category. But it's nice to hear a story that's at the opposite end of the spectrum, where it just shows that when push comes to shove, they're just guys and, willing to step up and do the right thing when circumstances require.
Absolutely, Jim. We were all very fortunate that we got out of that situation. And in another respect, we were very fortunate to receive an award from Governor George Busby for heroism.
Wow. Isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I do have another question I have two questions I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
Is there ever any proof that there's any possibility that when the guys were invited to the White House, I think it was in 1977, to play for President Carter's son Chip's birthday party, that there could have been, God forbid, any kind of illegal activity at the White House? Have you ever heard that?
I've heard that. I sure have. I can't say that there's any proof, but I would suspect that there could have been some form of legal activity at that time.
At the White House. Well, and that goes to show you that there is still a little rock and roll.
Yes, sir.
But no, my last question is, given the huge body of work that Ronnie produced with his bandmates in the Atlanta Rhythm section, musically, how do you think Ronnie would like to be remembered? What do you think he'd like for his legacy to be as a musician?
Well, I think Ronnie would like for his legacy to be that he loved what he did. And I don't think he would want to be remembered as a famous musician or anything like that, but just a loving, down-to-earth person that cared about people very much.
I would have to say, from seeing them live so many times, he had an ability that is not prevalent in every frontman, and that is he very much connected with the crowd.
Oh, Jim, he was so connected. It's just unbelievable. Anytime I look at a live recording of one of their shows, just to see his interaction with women, children, men, just, you could tell that he was just so connected with everyone. And that's really important.
I think that's a lot of what helps develop the tremendous loyalty in the fan base, because it's kind of like, when Gary Rossington passed and when Ronnie passed and when Barry Bailey and so many others have passed, those of us that really, you could honestly say, hardly knew them, maybe met them a few times, some folks that never met them at all, but it seemed very personal. And I think that's really evidence of that great connection.
Absolutely. I agree totally.
Well, Steve, listen, I can't thank you enough for taking time to be with us today and for sharing some great Ronnie and ARS stories. And hopefully our paths will continue to cross, and hopefully we're going to get some things going in the making music scene that'll definitely be of interest to our listeners.
Well, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a couple of stories with you.
This week's Hidden Gem is the 1968 Hourglass album, Power of Love. That band was a predecessor of the Allman Brothers and included Dwayne and Greg, plus a couple of guys that would go on to become big-time producers, Paul Hornsby and Johnny Sandlin, plus Jesse Carr that would later go on to fame with LeBlanc and Carr. It's a good album. It's worth a listen, especially if you are an Allman Brothers fan. I want to thank our guests Eddie Stone, Rob Walker, and Steve Hammond for being with us, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the Southern Voice Rock Show.
Thanks for listening.